Hi, and welcome to this conversation about the risk management framework at the Cyber Cafe. In this video, we'll discuss what the risk management framework is, which are the steps involved in it, why it's important, and how you can use it for your projects. Grab yourself a cup of coffee and let's get going. So first of all, what is the risk management framework? The RMF consists of 6 steps, applied continuously throughout a system's lifecycle: categorize, select, implement, assess, authorize, and monitor. Now, these steps will be explained in detail later in this video. But for now, let us focus on the fact that this is a continuous process. So risk management is not something that you do once at the beginning of your project and then you're done with it. Instead, risk management is something that needs to be done continuously throughout the entire life cycle of your system. And that means from the very first requirements gathering all the way to when the system is in production and being used by end users. Now, why is this important? Well, because risks are not static. They evolve over time. What might be a risk at the beginning of your project might not be a risk anymore at the end of the project. And vice versa. Something that is not a risk at the beginning of the project might become a serious risk towards the end of the project. So therefore, risk management has to be continuous. Now, the risk management framework is actually a set of best practices that have been defined by NIST. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they are a non-regulatory agency within the U.S. Department of Commerce. So their purpose is to develop and promote measurement, standards, and best practices, and that is exactly what the risk management framework is, a set of best practices. Now, risk management is important for all types of projects, regardless of size or complexity. However, if we're talking about large and complex projects, especially those that are mission-critical, then risk management becomes even more important. NIST SP 837, which is the risk management framework, is actually applicable to all systems and organizations, but it has been mandated for federal agencies. That means that if you work for a federal agency in the United States, and you're working on any kind of IT project, whether it's developing a new software application, or replacing an existing system, or implementing a major change to an existing system, then you have to use the risk management framework. So next, let's go through each of the 6 steps in the risk management framework. First, we have categorize. In this step, we identify the threats, the assets, and the risks. So threats are anything that can exploit a vulnerability and cause harm to our system. Then we have assets, which are anything that is valuable to our organization. And finally, we have risks, which is the potential for a threat to exploit a vulnerability and cause harm to our asset. Next, we have the select step in the risk management process. In this step, we analyze the risks that we identified in the previous step, and we select the ones that we're going to address. So how do we decide which risks to select? Well, there are many different ways to do this. You could select all risks, so you could analyze all of them. You could select high-level risks only. You could also select risks above a certain threshold. For example, you could say that any risk that has a likelihood greater than 50% and an impact greater than medium should be selected. Or you could select risks based on the risk appetite of your organization. So risk appetite is the amount of risk that an organization is willing to take on. So for example, if the risk appetite of your organization is low, then you would select all risks. Whereas if the risk appetite of your organization is high, then you would only select the major risks. Next, we have implement. In this step, we implement the risk responses. So remember that in the select step, we analyzed all of the risks and we decided which ones we were going to address. Well, in this step, we actually implement the actions that are going to mitigate those risks. So for example, if one of the risks that we identified was data breach, then a possible response would be to implement a secure coding standard as part of the SDLC. So secure coding standard or secure coding guidelines are basically a set of rules that developers must follow when they are writing code. The purpose of secure coding guidelines is to prevent the introduction of security vulnerabilities into the code base. So for example, one rule in a secure coding guideline might be to use parameterized queries to prevent SQL injection attacks. Another rule might be to validate all user input to prevent cross-site scripting attacks. Next, we have the assess step in the risk management process, and in this step, we actually evaluate the effectiveness of the risk responses that we implemented in the previous step. So we want to make sure that the things that we did actually worked, and that they mitigated the risks that we wanted to mitigate. There are many different ways to assess risk responses. You could do it manually, you could do it automatically, or you could use a combination of both manual and automatic assessments. Next, we have the authorize step in the risk management process. And in this step, we make a decision about whether or not we're going to accept the residual risk. So remember that in the assess step, we evaluated the effectiveness of our risk responses, and we found out that maybe some risks were still present, or maybe some risks were mitigated to an acceptable level, and some others were not. Well, in this step, we make a decision about whether or not we're going to accept the residual risk. So residual risk is the risk that remains after we have implemented our risk responses. So if the residual risk is below the risk appetite of our organization, then we accept it. But if the residual risk is above the risk appetite of our organization, then we reject the system. Now, authorization to continue is actually documented in what's called a risk acceptance document or a risk authorization document. This document is signed by the project sponsor or the project manager, and it basically says that the organization is aware of the risks and is willing to accept them. And the last step in the risk management framework is monitor. In this step, we continuously monitor the risks that were accepted in the previous step. So remember that risk management is a continuous process, and we want to make sure that the risks that we identified and accepted are still within the risk appetite of the organization. So for example, if a risk that we accepted has now increased to a level where it's above the risk appetite of the organization, then we need to take action. We need to find a way to mitigate the risk and bring it back within the risk appetite of the organization. Now, monitoring risk is very important because it helps us to detect changes in the risk profile of the system. It also helps us to prioritize our risk responses, and it also helps us to allocate resources effectively. So for example, if we have a risk that is continuously increasing, then we might want to allocate more resources to mitigating that risk. Now, risk management is a highly iterative process, so there will be times when we need to go back and redo some of the steps. So for example, if a risk that we previously accepted has now increased to a level where it's above the risk appetite of the organization, then we will need to go back and reassess the risk. If the risk is now considered to be too high, then we may need to go back and select additional risk responses. So risk management is a highly iterative process, and it requires a lot of communication and collaboration between different stakeholders. I hope this short video has been helpful to you, and please keep in mind that this has been a high-level overview of the risk management framework, and each of the steps involved in the risk management framework could be a topic for an entire video by itself. So if you want me to expand on any of the steps in the risk management framework, just let me know in the comments below, and I will be happy to create more videos on this topic. Thank you for watching, hit the thumbs up and subscribe for more content. See you next time.